Welcome to Introduction to Circadian Rhythms in Bipolar Disorder. This video is a part of a series being produced by the International Society for Bipolar Disorders Chronobiology Taskforce. This video will be an introduction to the neurobiology and behavioral aspects of circadian rhythms and how they present in bipolar disorder. My name is Michael McCarthy. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at UC San Diego and staff psychiatrist at the VA San Diego. I'm joined today by Dr. Colleen McClung, professor of psychiatry from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and Elise McGlashan, who is a research fellow in psychology from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. To get started, Colleen, what are circadian rhythms and why are they important?
Thanks, Michael. So the word circadian means about a day, and it describes the 24-hour cycles that occur in multiple processes throughout the brain and the body. The most prominent of these, of course, is the sleep-wake cycle. And humans are a diurnal species, meaning that they're programmed to be awake during the day and sleeping during the night. But besides the sleep-wake cycle, there are many other physiological processes that have a 24-hour rhythm, including things like blood pressure, body temperature, and appetite. There's also important processes in the brain that occur during sleep, including long-term memory formation and the removal of things like toxins and misfolded proteins that can harm the brain over time. Each person has their own endogenous circadian rhythm that might run a bit slower or a bit faster than 24 hours if you were in constant conditions without a light-dark cycle. But these rhythms can be set by light and other environmental cues, keeping them consistent over multiple days. And circadian rhythms are centrally controlled by a master pacemaker in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or we'll refer to it as the SCN, which receives input directly from the eye to help entrain and synchronize rhythms throughout the brain and the body. Each cell in every organ has its own clock, and without the SCN, they would all run on their own time. So you can think of the SCN as really the conductor of the orchestra of rhythms throughout the brain, throughout the body, to keep them in harmony and in sync with one another. And the SCN does this by controlling the release of hormones like melatonin, which is released at night to get the brain ready for sleep, as well as other signaling molecules and processes that go on throughout the brain and body.
So Colleen, you mentioned that our circadian rhythms need to be reset by light. How does that happen, Elise?
Great question, Michael. So in addition to our eyes allowing us to see, they also send information about light to areas of the brain which are not involved in vision, including the master clock and the SCN, like Colleen mentioned. So the SCN relies on light information received by the eyes to determine time of day and then organize the rhythms throughout our body accordingly. Light at different times of day will have different effects. So when we expose ourselves to light in the early evening or perhaps later than our normal bedtime, our clock becomes delayed or is pushed later, meaning that we may feel sleepier at a later time the following day. When we expose ourselves to light in the early morning, however, we can actually advance our clock, meaning our clock will be shifted earlier and we might feel sleepier before our normal bedtime the next day. When we experience really different kinds of schedules, such as when we do shift work or when we travel across time zones, our clock has to shift time zones too. And sometimes it can take quite a while for our clock to catch up because it needs to adapt to the new light-dark cycle. And this is what happens when we experience things like jet lag.
And so how does light affect our mood?
So there are two main ways that light can affect our mood. As Colleen mentioned earlier, our rhythms need to be synchronized throughout the brain and body, and having misaligned or poorly synchronized rhythms to the environment can impact on our sleep and other aspects of our health as well. Disrupted sleep can then lead to changes in our mood. So there is an indirect effect of light on mood via the synchronization of the circadian clock. The second way that light impacts our mood is directly. So light information is also transmitted from the eye to areas of the brain that are involved in the regulation of mood and cognition. And that's how we can feel immediately better when we are exposed to bright light, so such as when we go outside or when we get to work in a nice sunny office.
So Michael, what are some ways that these things are altered in people with bipolar disorder?
When scientists use electronic trackers to measure activity and sleep, consistent patterns emerge that distinguish people with bipolar disorder from people without the disorder. People with bipolar disorder commonly show lower amounts of activity during the day and irregular activity schedules. For instance, people with bipolar disorder often have more interruptions in daytime activity with more frequent breaks or naps. And a similar pattern occurs overnight with more time spent in bed, but with less efficient sleep and more frequent waking. People with bipolar disorder commonly report being night owls, with later wake-up times and a preference for overall activity later in the day and later bedtimes. Therefore, activity in bipolar disorder tends to be lower overall, more fragmented and shifted later into the day. Interestingly, these differences are not simply due to symptoms of mood, like mania and depression, but actually even persist even during times when these symptoms are relatively absent, during periods that we call euthymia, indicating that this is really a stable characteristic of people with bipolar disorder. When questions are asked of people with bipolar disorder, what are they doing over the course of a day? They often report later and irregular eating patterns and disrupted meal times, fewer social interactions, and disrupted work schedules that relate to these patterns of lower activity, later waking times, and disrupted sleep and activity schedules. And so some kinds of psychotherapy actually to reinforce these social rhythms as a means of stabilizing people's schedules and helping them maintain a stable mood.
Yeah, and some of the disruptions that Michael talked about in social and sleep-wake rhythms may actually be due to people with bipolar disorder having difficulty in training or synchronizing their circadian clocks. So some studies have shown that people with bipolar disorder experience an increased sensitivity to light. So that is, their clock tends to respond quite highly to even really low levels of light. This means that they might find that the timing of their circadian clock and perhaps their sleep-wake cycles as well is shifted quite easily, and it makes it difficult to maintain a regular schedule. People with bipolar disorder might also find that they're affected by changes in the seasons, as the amount of light available in the day changes quite significantly across the year. So people might find that the changes in day length or the difference between sunrise and sunset can cause changes in their sleep-wake rhythms as well as their mood states.
And human genetic studies have identified variations in genes that control circadian rhythms in individuals with bipolar disorder, suggesting that these irregularities in the sleep-wake and activity patterns commonly seen in this disorder, as well as the inability to adapt to sleep disruption, could be caused by genetic factors. In addition, multiple studies have found that individuals with bipolar disorder have abnormalities in a number of cellular processes that are tightly regulated by the circadian clock. These include disruptions in cellular energy production and metabolism, which could contribute to the extreme changes in energy state that are seen during mania and depression, as well as abnormalities in the regulation of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, signaling molecules in the brain that are important in regulating mood, reward value, and motivation. So if the normal rhythms in these important processes become lost or out of sync, this could trigger episodes in people with bipolar disorder.
Thanks, Colleen. So we've talked so far a bit about how circadian rhythms and circadian function might be altered in patients with bipolar disorder. Michael, could you tell us a bit about how medications might affect the system?
Sure. Many mood stabilizer medications not only help reduce the symptoms of mania and depression, but they can also help normalize sleep and activity rhythms. So the best understood example of this is lithium, which is one of the oldest, most commonly used mood stabilizers. Lithium works inside cells by changing the way signals are sent and received inside the neurons. And by shifting these signals, lithium can actually turn up the volume on the circadian clock and make circadian rhythms stronger. It can also change the timing of the rhythms so that the rhythms inside the cells match up better with the 24-hour rhythms of the light-dark cycle in the environment. And we can see in bipolar patients who get treated with lithium that circadian rhythms often get stronger. In patients where the rhythm doesn't seem to improve after lithium, these patients tend to be the ones who don't respond well to lithium and might need a different medication to help relieve their symptoms. And so we're still learning more about how other drugs work on circadian rhythms, and it's likely to be a little bit different for each medication. For instance, the mood stabilizer valproic acid may also increase circadian rhythm strength, while other drugs that are commonly used like lorazepam or melatonin may help align internal biological and environmental rhythms to be better in sync. Other medications might help sedate people and get them better at sleeping, but don't necessarily work on the circadian clock.
Thanks, Michael. So Colleen, we've learned a lot so far about how these systems might function in bipolar disorder. Could you tell us a bit more about what your group is doing specifically in the lab to sort of understand these things?
Sure. Our lab is trying to understand the molecular and cellular mechanisms of how circadian rhythm disruptions contribute to bipolar disorder. And to do this, we use both human postmortem brain tissue and animal models, so namely mice and rats. And in the human brain, we can measure expression of thousands of genes or proteins in particular brain regions and cell types over a population of individuals to identify which genes normally have a circadian rhythm in their expression in the brain and how these rhythms might be different in people with bipolar disorder. In our animal studies, we can manipulate the expression or rhythms of these circadian genes through a variety of molecular approaches within specific brain regions or cell types to determine what impact these rhythm disruptions have on cellular function, brain circuit communication, and the animal's behavior.
Great, thanks, Colleen. And Michael, could you tell us a little bit about your lab's work as well?
My laboratory studies circadian rhythms in cells that we collect from bipolar disorder patients. We use a molecular tool called the reporter gene that causes the cells to emit light in a rhythmic manner. Then using a special instrument, we can measure the light emissions from the cells as they go up and down over the circadian cycle and make precise estimates to determine how long it takes to complete a cycle, how strong the rhythm is. We can then go back and see what differences in the patient correlate with differences in the rhythm. For example, we have found that lithium-responsive bipolar patients have a stronger circadian rhythm compared to lithium non-responders, and that some of the genes identified for bipolar disorder in genetic association studies also have effects on the circadian rhythms in cells.
What about you, Elise?
So my lab is interested in understanding how light affects the brain and body in patients with mood disorders such as bipolar disorder, and how common medications might affect the system as well. So we use lots of different methods to do that, including MRI to look at brain activity changes in response to different kinds of light exposure, by measuring hormone levels in blood or saliva samples, and by measuring things like the pupil response to light, so either to brief flashes or long light exposures. As an example, we found that a larger response to blue light in the pupil is associated with symptoms of mania and hypomania, but not depression. In the future, we hope to be able to use assessments like that to better understand or identify people who might have bipolar disorder earlier in life so that we can more quickly find an effective treatment.
Fascinating work. It sounds like we'll be learning a lot more about this in the coming years. And thanks so much to both of you for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about the ISBD Chronobiology Taskforce on topics like light and dark therapies and social rhythms, look for our other YouTube videos that will also be out shortly or already available. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.